vice chair of the Buckman Direct Diversion, which is a regional water plant. We are regional wholesalers. We provided this last August, last month, about 42% of the water supply for the city and county of Santa Fe. And that plant is the plant that diverts Colorado River water from the Rio Grande and treats it at that facility and then pumps it up through the city. And it's part of our water portfolio. It helps meet the water needs of this community. So just a little background about me and my involvement in water. It's something I've been interested about even prior to becoming a city councilor, and I've been really excited to be able to continue this work, and certainly am thrilled to be here tonight. We have a great panel for you. We have Congresswoman Melanie Stansbury. She is going to be joining us on that screen on Zoom. We had wanted to have her here in the auditorium, but she's had to stay in Washington for a vote, and she has graciously allowed us some time this evening, and so we're going to go to her next on Zoom. She's born and raised in New Mexico, and she also has a deep water background, and we're just delighted to have her join us for a few minutes tonight. And so if we can go to Congresswoman Stansbury. There she is. Well, I'll let her take it away. Thank you, and welcome, Congresswoman. Thank you for being here.
All right, well, good evening, everyone. Just a quick audio check because I can't see you. Councilor Romero-Worth, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, great.
Yeah,
okay.
I think you're coming in loud and clear, right, everybody? All right, take it away.
All right, wonderful. Well, good evening, everyone. I am deeply sad that I'm not able to join you all in person, but I'm glad that I'm able to join you virtually this evening. I'm here in Washington, D.C., and for any of you that are following the news, you know it's been a strange and chaotic week here in Washington. In particular, we're working hard to try to keep the government open and functional. Right now, there is an effort within the GOP to try to shut things down, and we know how catastrophic that would be for New Mexico, especially because we have so many federal employees and active duty military. But my first and always love is water, so I always embrace the opportunity to talk about water. I call myself a bona fide water nerd. I've worked in water resources for over 20 years, and I've had the amazing honor of working with your counselor, Romero-Worth, as well as Jesse Roach, who is the city's water manager. And I'll tell you a funny story about Jesse at the end here, Dr. Roach at the end here, because I think it really illustrates the point that I think we want to make here. But first, I want to just comment about the times that we're living in. I probably don't need to tell a room full of folks from Santa Fe, but we're living through an unprecedented time in the history of our planet with respect to climate change. We've already recorded and seen that there's increased temperatures, reduced stream flows, and it's predicted that over the next several decades, we're going to continue to see the decline in especially snowpack in New Mexico and the Rocky Mountains. And the reason why this is so significant for a place like New Mexico is that our entire ecosystem and hydrology has been dependent on a relatively stable hydrologic system for centuries and centuries. So we all know the cycle from living in New Mexico. In the springtime, we get snow melt that runs off the mountains. That's what waters our crops and helps support our cities. In the spring and early summer, crops are planted. We have storage facilities and dams and reservoirs that help to get us through the dry season until the rainy season and monsoon season sets in the late summer. And then in the fall, it cools down, we get some rain, and it starts snowing again. And we've had that regime for many, many centuries, and that is what our acequias were built on. It's how our pueblos have grown and sustained themselves since time immemorial. And it's what our modern infrastructure was predicated on. And so as climate change is happening, as temperatures are changing, we know that we're going to have to adapt the ways in which we manage these systems and the ways in which we sustain ourselves. And the first thing I want to say is that it will be impossible to do so without really changing the ways in which we think about water, the ways in which we manage infrastructure at scale, the ways in which we manage the landscape itself, our forests, our mountain ecosystems, how we manage stream flow and storage, and to ensure that we're doing so in a way that is coordinated across federal, state, and local boundaries, as well as international and interstate boundaries. But one of the things that I think we are very fortunate in New Mexico is that we have the best water managers. And I can tell you from 20 years working in the business, we probably have the best water managers and leaders that we've ever had in the history of our state right now in key positions. And while we're seeing this summer a very large disruption to the regime that I just described with the Rio Grande going dry and low water storage, we still are able to manage through this crisis because we have such extraordinary water managers sitting in places where they can help coordinate across all these federal, state, and local. I get asked a lot what Congress is doing to help address the crisis. Myself personally, part of why I was willing and interested in serving in Congress was to bring my expertise working in water to help support our nation and our states and our communities as we're going through this huge fundamental change. And over the last several years since I've been serving in Congress, I've helped to pass more water bills than any other member in the 117th Congress. We are working to get many of these bills across the finish line, including the Water Data Act, which is a bill that's based on a bill that we passed in the state of New Mexico. We're working with Colorado, Texas, and the country of Mexico on a Rio Grande Water Security Act to help foster cooperation and funding across the 1,900 miles of stretch of that river. We're working on multiple tribal water bills to help our tribes and pueblos access dollars to build out infrastructure and improve the resilience and long-term sustainability of water systems. We've been working to get funding through the Water Resources Development Act and the Farm Bill to help with improved water management across our communities. And last year, we passed two of the most significant bills in modern history that have to do with water, including the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the most significant climate legislation to ever pass in the history of the United States, as well as the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which passed November before last to make generational investments in infrastructure. Our biggest challenge right now is helping to get these resources into our communities. I just got back from 6 weeks traveling the state, traveling across New Mexico's first congressional district, and there is not a single community in New Mexico who is not struggling with water right now. And while there are significant federal resources, those have to be leveraged with the expertise, the support of local scientists and engineers and water experts and conservationists and community members and tribes to really understand how do we prioritize and plan for the future. Now, what I can tell you about the city of Santa Fe specifically, though it is not in my district, is that Santa Fe is way ahead of the curve. Long before many of the rest of our communities or even our state was willing to acknowledge that climate change was real and having a measured impact on our ecosystems and our hydrology, the city of Santa Fe took it upon itself to do a long-term watershed plan. And really under the leadership now of Dr. Roach and the current city council and mayor are implementing that vision. It helped to secure a long-term water supply through the Buckman diversion and water resources that had been previously secured through federal and state partnerships, and helped to really identify the measures that the city would have to take to conserve water, which is how Santa Fe ended up being one of the most progressive cities in the state of New Mexico and certainly across the West in conserving water. So all of these things are important elements. The other piece I want to just briefly touch on, because I get asked about a lot, is the Supreme Court's recent decision in the Sackett case that was handed down just a few short months ago. For those of you that are not familiar, the Clean Water Act was passed in 1970. Congress was very clear Americans should have access to clean water, but over the years there have been jurisdictional battles about what the Clean Water Act would apply to. And after a sustained attack for many years, the current court gutted the Clean Water Act and said that it would not apply to wetlands and ephemeral streams, of which New Mexico's waterways make up about 90% of our waterways. So I am working with my colleagues in Congress to try to put into place a legislative fix. We won't be able to do that until Democrats are back in the majority, because there is not the political will in the current dysfunctional Congress, but it is extremely important that New Mexico advance its own water quality and permitting program at the state level, and that we aggressively pursue it at the local level as well. And so that's why it's very important that we have local leaders like your city councilor who's hosting this conversation this evening, and like Dr. Roach. And that brings me to the story that I promised to tell you. So I first met Dr. Roach in Istanbul, Turkey. I think it would be maybe 15 years ago, when I was a PhD student, and he was there as a federal employee working for Sandia National Labs. And I sat in a giant conference room, and two tall PhD engineers stood up in this conference room in Istanbul in a room full of hundreds of people and said, "Hi, we're scientists from Sandia National Labs, and we're working to try to figure out how to solve water conflict around the world." And those two individuals were Jesse Roach and Howard Purcell, who are two of the foremost water hydrologists, modelers, and managers in the world working on these issues. And you, City of Santa Fe, are fortunate to have one Jesse Roach as your water manager. And with that, Councilor Romero Worth, I will turn it back to you, and I'm happy to stick around and take questions.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Thank you for joining us this evening. How much time do you have? I don't know. We were going to go to Jesse Roach, and then we also have Andrew Erdmann here for presentations. So I don't know how long you can stick around, but you know, if you can, terrific.
I'll stick around for as long as I can.
Okay. All right. So we're going to. I think we need to give everybody the full plate of what we have in store for you all tonight, and then we'll go back to questions. All right, our next speaker is Jesse Roach, Dr. Jesse Roach. Oh, no, I'm sorry. They're pointing at each other. No. Andrew Erdmann, who is the manager of the State Water Planning Program at the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission. And I had the opportunity when I was first elected as city councilor to work with Andrew, because at that time, before he went to the state, he worked for the city. And he was in our water conservation office and part of the water division team. And I'm very fortunate to have been able to work with him before he went up a level and is now at the state. So if you'll welcome him, he's got some slides to present to you tonight as well.
Hello. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and presenting tonight. I'm a little bit intimidated with the Congresswoman and one of the world's foremost experts here on either side of me, but I'm going to do the best that I can. My name's Andrew Erdmann. I used to work at the city. I was with the water company and in the conservation office for a number of years, and now I work over at the Interstate Stream Commission, and I'm the Water Planning Program Manager. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work we do at the Interstate Stream Commission, and specifically about what we're facing relative to climate change and some of the planning work we're doing to address that. Can we go to the next slide, please? Great. Okay. Well, so that's what I'm going to talk about here. We're gonna look at water. Wow. Is this better if I'm closer? Yes. This is the way. Okay. So we're going to talk about the Interstate Stream Commission and what we do as an agency, and a little about sort of the status quo and what water use looks like in New Mexico today, where we use all of our water, and then talk about what we're facing going forward relative to kind of where we're coming from and what we're expecting for climate change impacts. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so first thing, the Interstate Stream Commission. The Interstate Stream Commission it's frequently described as a sister agency to the Office of the State Engineer. For any of you who have water rights of your own or domestic wells that you've had to deal with, you probably have some familiarity with the State Engineer's Office. I'm gonna make sure I get this just right. So the authority, the role of the Interstate Stream Commission is to investigate supply, develop, conserve, and protect, and do any and other things necessary to protect, conserve, and develop the waters and stream systems of the state. Most of that comes down to managing the interstate stream compacts. A lot of people are familiar particularly with the Rio Grande Compact and the Colorado River Compact. New Mexico is a party to 8 different compacts. In some cases we're upstream, in some cases downstream, but that's the bulk of the work that we do at the agency I'm at. We also do regional and state water planning, which I'm going to talk about more, Indian water rights settlements, and the state strategic water reserve, which are all critical parts as we look forward into the future of water management in the state. Can we do the next slide, please? Okay. So this is us. This is our program, the State Water Planning Program. We have essentially 2 pieces that we manage. The regional water plans, which we just got a bill passed in the last legislative session. That's going to really reinvigorate how we do regional water planning. I'm going to give a little plug at the end because I'm really hopeful to get some folks who are here tonight to be involved as we get further out and do some engagement opportunities next summer. And then the other piece we do is the state water plan. We have a new one of those due out this year. And it looks at essentially what the status is of water and water law around the state. Okay, can we go to the next slide? So, this is the status quo of how water use works in the state. The vast majority of water use is for agriculture, 77.5%. I present this in a lot of different places in the state, and I often don't have to be the one who says this because someone will jump up in the audience to make sure that I say it. So I'm gonna explain a little bit about agricultural water use. One important piece of understanding that number, because it is huge, 77.5%, and that's pretty similar to other states in the West. A lot of that water gets returned. Some of it gets used over and over again. It's very difficult for us to quantify specifically how much that is, but that is an important component of agricultural water use. Our next piece we have here, public water supply, so that's about 10%. That's all the water in Santa Fe, Albuquerque, Cruces, every domestic well in the city, in the state, all the mutual domestics, all the small towns, all of that is about 10%. Similar to agriculture, a big portion of that can actually be returned. So like in Santa Fe, which is the one I'm most familiar with, having worked there, better than half of the water that gets diverted, I think, is available. And Jesse will talk about that, I'm sure, in more detail. But so like agriculture, municipal use tends to return water. The reason that's important is that our next category here is reservoir evaporation, which does not return any water. That 7.5% that's up there for reservoir evaporation, it evaporates, it's gone. So that's our next biggest category, and it's almost as big as the municipal water category. And then that top piece, that ICMP, that's industrial, commercial, mining, and power. Frankly, it's real hard to make statements about that because there's a lot of breadth that's being covered between the practices that fall into that category. But in terms of its overall use, it's about 5%. Yes, so in terms of looking at how all those pieces work, some of the challenges that we're facing are also listed here. So ag is the biggest piece. Water rights are administered based on priority dates. So what that means essentially is that the older water right is, the older that use was established for that right. In a time when there's shortage, that's the water right that would get water first, and it would get its full amount. So that's what our priority system, that's how that works. The levels of groundwater use that we have at this point are essentially not sustainable. Groundwater is difficult to talk about because I heard a guy say recently, you can't take the family out to show them the aquifer, right? So it's really challenging to get people to understand the significance of groundwater. The best I can really say is most of the technology we have to drill all the wells is only about a century old. So to the extent that we're using a lot of groundwater, that's a relatively new thing to do. And then the last piece of this, interstates, compacts, and endangered species flow, those aren't going anywhere. We're still gonna have to deliver water downstream. So, next slide, please. All right, I'll go through these a little faster because I got a couple slides to illustrate what we're expecting for climate change. So the way this one works, the individual dots are individual years, the horizontal lines are 10-year averages. The top part that's red is temperature, and the bottom part that's blue is precipitation. So precipitation varies a lot. We're expecting that to continue. We're also expecting it to get hotter with longer summers. So effectively that means we have less water in streams to use because we'll lose more to evaporation and the demands of the environment will be a little bit higher. You can see that the temperature is basically already starting to step up a little bit. And certainly this summer we've seen lots of stories about climate change related events. And also, you know, here locally we started with this huge spring, right? As good as we can kind of hope to have. And actually really thankful for the rain the last couple days, but up until then it was getting pretty warm. Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? All right, so this is more information about climate change. What you're looking at on the top left is sort of the historic condition for how much of the state was considered arid. I'm sure there's a very specific scientific definition of this, but aridity is basically like the for real desert, right? Real, you know, it's cactus, it's sand. When the water hits the ground, a lot of it runs off pretty fast. A fair amount of our state is composed of land like this. And what these slides show is essentially that it's going to increase over time. That's our expectation, which has all kinds of impacts relative to soil health, water runoff, infiltration. It actually also usually means that we'll have less water being used by the environment in some of those places, which is challenging for us when we look at kind of how the future might look different. So as you can see in the bottom section here, that's the change we're expecting. And for people who are real familiar with the geography of New Mexico, those white sections are pretty much mountain peaks. We're expecting increased aridity just about everywhere else. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, first thing I'm going to say is this slide looks much more dramatic than it in fact is. It's a 5-degree increase in temperature all over the state that we're expecting, and the difference is in Farmington, it's 7 degrees. So I know that makes it look pretty awful for Farmington, but this came from a federal report. I didn't pick the colors. But we're essentially, you know, looking at a change where some cities are going to be, you know, a little bit more like a further south city. So perhaps we have a climate a little more like Albuquerque, maybe they're a little more like Cruces as we move forward into the future. Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so it's a little hard to see, but this is the United States right here, the place where we stop having data, that's the Mexico border. What you're looking at with the brown are areas that are expecting increasing water stress, and the blue are places that are essentially expecting to have more water. The reason I like to put this slide up is to kind of point out that this is a regional issue. New Mexico is not alone in this, so we have partners in facing this in the region. We're also not going to be able to just hop over the border and import a bunch of water from a neighboring state because they're in the same boat. Okay, can we go ahead another slide? Okay, and I promise this is about to wrap up my gloom and doom section here because the back half of this is better. Okay, so these are some additional problems we're expecting related to climate change. I don't know that I'll go through the whole list, but more persistent drought, catastrophic wildfires, declining aquifers. There's a concern that as we have less surface water and we draw the aquifers down more, that could become kind of a spiral. Need for stormwater control, consistent investment is something that certainly is being addressed really aggressively right now. And you know, obviously a planner got to write this because we finished with the need for long view planning, so I guess that's a little self-promotion there. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, but here's what we're really facing. So this is the real issue we've got, is trying to maintain a balance for how much water we have and how much we're using. Over the past 100 years or so, we've essentially been able to increase how much water reliability we have. We've built dams, then we built lots and lots of dams, and we got wells, and so we've essentially been increasing reliability of water for a long time, which is great, but we're all pretty used to a system that works that way. And just as the Congresswoman mentioned earlier, we're looking at a place where that balance is going to shift a little bit. So instead of being able to have technologies that necessarily deliver these enormous amounts of water that we got, we're really looking at some reduction as we go forward and how we adapt for that. So the other side of this is how much water we use, right? Sorry, the microphone's drying me out. So the water use side of this is where we have some control. And you know, we talked at the beginning about agriculture using the majority of water. There are all kinds of really amazing, innovative technologies out there to improve the efficiency of agriculture. There's a lot of hurdles associated with implementation though, and the cost for farmers, but the technologies are out there. They're in all sorts of different regions. It's absolutely something we can do. The other piece of this is water that gets used for cities, right? So one piece of this, so one part that's important about this, right? We have some water uses that are essentially still expanding, despite the fact that we have less water. So one of those is cities. Cities are uniquely able to hold water rights for 40 years that are unused. And the state, our agency, wants them to do that because those are the water rights they're going to use for future growth. Santa Fe, as has been mentioned, is extremely on top of this. The amount of water that Santa Fe holds unused is, Jesse can talk to that, but it's substantial. And that's largely due to the conservation work that's happened in the past. But as we look at the future, right, that's one area that growth can increase because those rights already belong to cities. Another area, we have some drinking water access issues around the state that are being addressed. One of the really prominent ones is the Navajo Gallup pipeline. That's a big project happening in the northwest side of the state. It's going to take decades probably and billions of dollars, but it's a rural drinking water project to make sure we've got drinking water to folks who need it around the state. And another type that's expanding is Indian water rights settlements. So there's a lot of areas that those haven't been resolved. So this balance is something we really can't be complacent about. Trying to maintain how this balance works given the amount of water as it changes, given the fact that needs are always changing, that our efficiencies in farms are more available than before, that cities have worked hard to have the ability to grow in the future by working hard to save in the past. Those are all going to be part of the solution. So as we look at this, we really I've been trying to talk about a balance instead of a supply-demand scenario for this so that we don't all go to supply-side solutions for this thing right away. I really think it's about kind of maintaining balance and the constant effort it takes to keep adapting. So okay, can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so this is my quick plug for our water planning work that we're doing at the state. So this is the new bill that we passed, the Water Security Planning Act. This is going to be looking at rural water use across the state. As the Congresswoman mentioned, water problems are all over the state, and trying to get the money out on the ground to build projects and get things addressed is really challenging. There's been a lot of stories in the paper in the last couple weeks, or it's probably months at this point. My whole sense of time's off since pandemic. But there's been some stories about some systems like in the southern part of the state that had some like poor maintenance issues and were losing a lot of water relative to their production through like leaky pipes. That's a pretty prominent problem, and trying to figure out how to address this is something we're going to tackle all over the state. But truly, there is an unprecedented amount of resources in this. I mean, I'm about to say that the leadership and everybody who's doing this work is fantastic, and realizing that that might reflect on me a little bit, which was not my intention. Everyone who's working on this in the state and in the cities truly have their hearts in the right place, is really trying to do the right thing by everybody. It is a complex problem to try and solve, but New Mexico has faced droughts like this before and with fewer tools available. So I think this is something we're all going to be able to do. So with that, I think I'm done.
Yeah, make sure you're hydrating because you're not done yet. Okay, our last speaker tonight is Dr. Jesse Roach, who you've heard a little bit about. He is the director of the City of Santa Fe Water Division Department, and many of you, he kind of makes the rounds. Many of you may have already heard him, but he brings to us a wealth of information, and we're just delighted that he can join and provide the slides he's going to show you tonight.
Thank you. Appreciate that introduction and the undeserved introduction from the Congresswoman. Puts me in trying to recover from that. So I'm going to talk to you about, I think you all know, I'm going to try and answer the question of, do we have enough water to support new housing? And let's go ahead and get going. Next slide. So the quick answer is yes. And I'm going to sort of build this slide as we go through the presentation. But real briefly, what I'm showing here is on the left our actual demand and production of water over the last, from 8 years, from 2014 through 2021. The second bar is how much we estimate was sustainably available during that time. The third bar is where we're trying to get within the next decade. And then the final bar is, what does it all mean in the face of climate change and potential growth in our community? So next slide, please. So I want to back up and provide a little bit of context in terms of what the water system is. We have 4 different supplies. So this map is a sort of a bird's eye view looking at the Santa Fe watershed, which is shown in the blue line, and the city within it, looking north up the Rio Grande and Chama valleys. And the 4 water supply sources that we access are, in order of development, the Santa Fe River, which is treated at the Canyon Road Water Treatment Plant, shown on the right side of that map, the city well field, which is local groundwater within our watershed, and then the Buckman well field, which is regional groundwater, and then finally the Buckman Direct Diversion, or BDD, which has been mentioned already, and where we divert from the Rio Grande Colorado River water that is stored up in Heron and Abiquiu reservoirs on the Chama system. In addition to that, we do have reclaimed water that is used at the moment to irrigate turf, golf courses, and parks. Next slide, please. So this is another way of looking at those 4 sources and sort of how they were put to use in 2022. So last year, about half of the water came from rivers, and also referred to as surface water. We sort of think of our rivers as our checkings account. It's the water we can see, it's the renewable water, it's the water we want to use preferentially. And so we see that about 80% came from rivers, and half of that was from the Rio Grande, actually Colorado River water diverted from the Rio Grande, and half of that was Santa Fe River water. And then 20% came from our well fields. Next slide, please. So backing up a little bit, the water utility started in about 1881 when we constructed the first reservoir along the Santa Fe River. And this graph is showing from 1925 to 1995 the use of water and the sources where that water came from. And so you can see on the far left that the water was only from the Santa Fe River. That was the original source and the reason that we're all here and the reason that the town is here. And what happened in the 50s is we hit what at that time was a historic drought, the 1950s drought, and the Santa Fe River wasn't enough for the demand that had grown. And so we very quickly and sort of in emergency status drilled some wells locally so that we could tap into our savings account essentially and make it through that. But the demand for water continued to rise, and really what characterizes this period is exponential growth in demand for water. And so pretty soon, the 2 water sources, the local water sources, were not enough water. And so we added the first regional water source, and that was the Buckman well field, and that's the orange color on top that came in the 1970s. But you can see that the growth continued. And by 1995, we were pumping more water out of our well fields than was being naturally recharged. So we were unsustainably mining our groundwater resource. Next slide, please. But one amazing thing that happened, 1995 was sort of a watershed moment for us, and in that year, the city bought what was previously a private water company from PNM. And since 1995, we can see that in that year we peaked at, and the units are sort of arcane acre-feet units that are an agricultural unit, but it's the unit we use in water resources management for annual volumes. We peaked at over 13,000 acre-feet of use in 1995. And since then, over the past 27 or 28 years, we've dropped down to where we're producing less than 9,000 acre-feet a year now. So that's a 33% reduction. And at the same time, the population has continued to grow. So we're serving 25% more people now than we were in 1995, using 33% less water. That is an incredible story of conservation. Next slide, please. So another way to look at that conservation story is this graph shows from 1995 on the left to 2022 on the right. The blue bars are the population served. So you can see, and the axis for that is on the right side. So we went from somewhere in the 70,000 range up to, high 80,000s of population served during this period. And at the same time, the numbers shown in orange are they're essentially the total water used divided by the population served, and so it's this funny metric called the gallons per capita per day, but it's essentially an attempt to attribute all the water use to the average person. And so we went from the average person sort of having 168 gallons of water use per day attributable to them, down to almost half of that in 25 years. So again, remarkable conservation story. Next slide, please. So one of the things to drill in on that is in 2022, our gallons per capita per day in Santa Fe was 88. Of that 88, 60, so about 70% of it was residential use. And then that's what's shown on the left there, the breakdown, that most of our use is residential and the remainder being commercial. And then on the right side, looking at the majority of our residential use is also single family use, but there are some multifamily, so think of apartments, and that water use is very efficient comparatively. So next slide, please. So we talk about the city of Santa Fe as a leader in conservation, and we are, and we have a conservation table here that I hope everyone will visit after the questions when we have a chance to have some food and drink and talk a little bit. So they're out there. But what does it mean to be a leader in conservation? Well, the things that they're thinking about, the things that they're doing, but the proof kind of is in the pudding. So on the left side, and I apologize, you probably can't read the headings, but the left side is showing residential water use, so just the residential piece of GPCD, and back in 2015, a little dated, but it was a piece I found that compares across states. So we have from top to bottom, New Mexico, Texas, the US average, California, Washington, Oregon, Nevada, Colorado, Arizona, Utah, Idaho. You can see that amongst Western states, New Mexico has the lowest GPCD. Okay, so now let's look within New Mexico, and on the right, we're showing the GPCD, now the total GPCD again. We're showing for all the cities in New Mexico that serve at least 10,000 people. And we can see that in order from left to right, Carlsbad, Las Cruces, Los Lunas, Ruidoso, Gallup, Portales, Los Alamos, Albuquerque, Rio Rancho, and Santa Fe, we're the only system that serves more than 10,000 people below 100, and we're actually below 90. So tremendous conservation success, and I hope you take a chance to talk to our conservation folks and learn some of the ways we're getting there. Next slide, please. So zooming in again, there's one other piece. So conservation is huge for us, but there's one other, I'm gonna say, sort of paradigm shift that occurred between 1995 and the present that leaves us in a very enviable place from a water resources perspective. And that is that we brought the BDD online, and as Councilor Romero-Worth mentioned, it's a city-county combined project. I talk about it like it's ours. It's not ours, but the BDD came online and we started to access our Colorado River water directly from the Rio Grande. And you can see that happened in 2011. And for the last 12 years or whatever it is, we are a river water dominated sort of utility. We're using the river water that we can see. We know how much comes in. We know how much is stored in the reservoirs. And we're just using the wells enough to make sure they're there. And they are our backup supply. We have our wells in reserve. Next slide, please. And so if we think about our wells as our savings account, the amazing thing is that since we shifted to this surface water dominated paradigm, the wells are now recovering. And so the example here is that on average, and you can't read the number, I apologize, but on average, our city well field lost about 150 feet of the well levels dropped by an average of about 150 feet from 1950 when we first drilled them to 2010. And then we brought the BDD online. We shifted to mostly using river water and resting the well fields. And 60 feet of that 150-foot loss has been recovered as the wells are coming back. So we're replenishing our savings account, and we intend to leave it as a savings account. Next slide, please. So, okay, so now I'm going to start rebuilding this figure that I hit you with right out of the gate, because I wanted you to know that the answer was yes in case you got up and left. But we've been below 9,000 acre feet per year for the last, going on 10 years now. And we estimate that we have about, so the left is actuals, and then the second one is our estimated sustainable availability. And so you can't read the number for groundwater, but we estimate about 4,500 acre feet, meaning we could pump that year in and year out, and it wouldn't impact the levels in the wells. So we were not sustainable. That's our estimate of sustainability. And when you put those two things together, we're using about 3/4 of our sustainable availability. Now, is that enough? We don't think so. We've heard plenty about climate change tonight, and so we think we need to do more, and that'll be conservation. Next slide. I think the next slide is just an animation. So what's the plan from here? Where do we go from here? Next slide, please. So I want to talk about some of the sort of in-the-weeds conservation stuff that we're doing. And again, I encourage you to talk to Christine Chavez and Bob Wood, who are here, about some of the specifics. But the Green Building Code. So the City of Santa Fe adopted a Green Building Code. It has a specific water efficiency rating score that goes on it. And this is a table from it where you have to choose a combination of toilets and shower heads and sinks and faucets and dishwashers that will bring you to 30% below what the industry standard would be for a house with those things. And the industry standard keeps going down as well. So this is aggressive conservation targets that's built into our building code. Next slide, please. Another one that I want to pitch here is ion water. We have, so on the left, you can't even see in the background there was supposed to be a picture of a water meter, but the more important piece is, if you live in the city of Santa Fe, you have a water meter that's measuring how much water is going into your home, and there's a little endpoint connected, and it's sending out a signal once a day that's basically saying how much water was used at that meter, and it's not just the daily use. If you look there on that screenshot in the middle, that's a screenshot from my phone yesterday when I was putting these slides together, that on Tuesday of this week, my household used 108 gallons of water, and most of it was used at night. And I can tell each hour. In fact, I can tell I probably didn't go to sleep until after 11. This is pretty cool, and everybody has access, every city customer has access to this. You just go to savewatersantafe.com, you download the app, you connect your account information to it, and you will be able to keep track of exactly how much you're using down to the hour if you like, and you can set it to give you alerts so that if something breaks, you don't figure it out when you get that $500 water bill, you get an alert on your phone the next day. Next slide, please. So just, again, talking about where do we go with conservation, we've done a lot, but there's still more to be done. We've focused largely on indoor rebates for single-family residents. And that's great. That's, as I showed, that's where a majority of our use is. But we also are focusing on the commercial sector more and more. And so I'm not going to dive into the details here, but at the table afterwards, folks to answer those questions. Next slide, please. So one thing I do want to say about where we go with conservation has to do with what I'm going to call the third paradigm shift. So I talked about the first two paradigm shifts that have occurred for us since 1995. The first one is conservation. It's always the first place we go. The second one was shifting to surface water and letting our groundwater recover as a reserve. The third one is reuse. And so we are working on a project called the San Juan Chama Return Flow Project. I'll talk about a little bit more about that in the next slide. But as we transition to the ability to either indirectly or directly reuse effluent, the paradigm of where we want to save water is likely to shift a little bit. Because water that's used indoors, we're going to get another crack at, so to speak. But water that's used outdoors, potable utility water used in gardens or for irrigation, it sort of is lost to the system from our utility perspective. So that's the third paradigm shift, and that's where we're going now. And it does have implications for conservation as well. Next slide, please. So the reason that reuse is such a big deal, and Andrew alluded to this earlier, is this is the same kind of graphic that I showed earlier. And the upper right circle is showing, and now these are averages from 2013 to 2020, showing, you know, most of our water comes from the Rio Grande and the Santa Fe River with a little bit from the wells. But then fully, nearly two-thirds, so in this case for this average is about 64%, but almost two-thirds of the water that we produce ends up being used indoors, flowing through the sewer collection system, and being treated at the water reclamation facility, which is down near the airport. And that number by itself is bigger than any one of our sources. So we have 4 sources, and then we have two-thirds of all that water that we could have another crack at. So that's a big deal. And that's the next horizon for us. That's the next frontier. Next slide, please. So that is where we get the third bar here, is that with the San Juan Chama Return Flow Project in place, we then estimate essentially tripling how efficiently we can use the Colorado River portion of our portfolio, and with that going from 12,000 acre feet roughly of estimated sustainable availability to closer to 20,000 acre feet of sustainable available water. Next slide, please. But again, climate change and growth, what do we do about those things? And so we are in the midst of a sort of multi-year process. And we started it in 20, sort of laying out this sort of planning process. We had some public engagement to get ideas and feedback on this. And then last year, we came out with demand projections in terms of what we think population will do in the city limits all the way through 2100, and how efficiently we will use water as well. So population and the efficiency of water use to get us an estimated demand of water for all the way for the next until 2100. And then this year we're working on the supply projections. So that's climate change. That's that's like forest fires. Those are the things that could disrupt the supply. We have a numerical tool, so a model of the system that's called Stewards that we're rolling out so that we can then take the supply and the demand and put them together in a computerized representation of our system to see, are there shortages? And if there are shortages, we need to address those with what we're calling adaptation strategies. And so at each process, each wheel here, we are either rolling out information to the public, those are the black arrows, or engaging in public sort of solicitation of values and true feedback, and that'll come in the adaptation strategies piece. And all that is to develop sort of 40 and 80-year plans for what our water resources look like until 2100. Next slide, please. So that takes us back to where we started. You now understand the first 3 bars, and then the 4th bar is we don't know exactly how climate change will impact our water supply, but we do have the best available science to bring to bear on that. And we think the magnitude by the end of this century is somewhere in the quarter to a third reduction of surface availability and groundwater availability. We don't know exactly how much water we'll be using by 2100, but we have estimated it with, you know, the demand projections that I mentioned. And so putting those things together, that's the final bar, and we'll continue to work on that and update it as we move forward. And that's all I have.
Okay, that was a lot to take in. So the good news is we are recording this. It will be available on demand, and you can go back and watch any portion of it or study these slides. As I mentioned, Jesse Roach does do these presentations. In other places, we do, I think on the city's website, have other recorded, you guys want to come up? Other recorded presentations. You know, maybe we want to, or move back a little bit because we have the Congresswoman on as well. Do you want me, I just don't want to block her out. Andrew, do you want a mic? Sure. Looks like we can all have. Okay, what we're going to do here, really quickly, so that you can all go have some refreshments, is we're going to take a few questions from the audience. I do want to ask a couple questions of our panel. And I think it's important to know that the city has grown, as Jesse outlined, and at the same time, our water demand has gone down. And maybe you could just talk a little bit about why we've been successful there. I think there are a couple of things. One was conservation, but maybe you could also talk about the tiered billing structure that we implemented a while back and how that's had an impact.
Sure. When people ask, okay, how did we do that? And you probably noticed in the GPCD graph there were a couple big drops. There are sort of three main things that I point to, and actually Andrew's as qualified to answer this as I am, so I'll let you jump in on whatever I miss. The first one, as Councilor Romero-Worth mentioned, is that when the city bought the utility, they implemented a tiered rate structure, and so that allows you to get a certain amount of water every month on your bill for a certain rate, and then if you want more than that, or if you're using more than that, it triples. The sort of dollars per gallon that you're paying triples once you go into that second tier. And so the idea is to send a very strong economic signal that you're using more water than we think you have to. And so that was a big one, and I think that has had a large, had a lot to do with the great conservation we saw. The other one was a big focus on indoor appliances and specifically toilets. And I think that the city was very aggressive in creating a rebate program to hurry the transition from old toilets to newer toilets. Now you go to Home Depot, you can't find one of those giant water hogging 4 gallons per flush toilets. So eventually that transition was going to come, but the city was very aggressive in hurrying that transition along. And then the third one I would say has to do with awareness, and 2002 became a year for hydrologists, which suddenly knocked the 1950s drought out of the books, as like 2002 was sort of Watergeddon here in Santa Fe, and people who lived through it remember how desperate it felt. And that, from that point forward, I think there has been built a conservation ethic in Santa Fe that permeates our sort of day-to-day life. And so those would be the three things that I really point at as reasons that we're able to be so successful and such a national leader in conservation.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to throw to Andrew, part of that too was the city connecting growth to water use. And I know when you were at the city, you were very involved in this. And I think it's important for people to know that when new development comes online, they have to bring water, their water use is projected, and they have to bring that with their project. Maybe you could speak to that a little bit. I know that's not your current
No, I'm happy
day
to.
job, but I know you know a lot about it.
And it's Jesse's program, so if I speak incorrectly, I'm sure he'll correct me. Yeah, that's correct. The city has a water bank program, so it's able to essentially get water rights brought in to account for the additional use when there's a new apartment or something built, right? So the city has a number of rights. Jesse had them in his graph. They're the different colors on those things, right? So there's the Buckman well field, there's the city well field. When water gets transferred in by developers to do something new, the way that those water rights essentially get used is as what's called offsets. So that's basically means they're used to allow the city to use the Buckman well field. And so one of the really nice things about that, I mentioned earlier, the city has the ability to hold these water rights unused. So keeping in mind, like as Jesse mentioned, the city's trying to let the wells recover and rest, right? So those offsets, generally speaking, aren't getting used, which is one of the benefits of that law for the city to be able to hold those for a long period of time. And what essentially they do is allow you to have the groundwater backup in the event that there's a dry year coming up so that you could continue to supply whatever the project is, be it in an apartment building or a commercial project or whatever. But it's a fantastic program. And if I could actually also just mention one other piece, the work in the conservation office, Christine Chavez is here. She's awesome, she's amazing. She's definitely one of those people who's the right person in the right job that the state's fortunate to have doing things. And we're at the state side trying to continue to learn from that, right? So we're really interested in trying to get some of the data about the savings that the city's had from these indoor appliances and figure out how to translate that data so we can essentially put it in front of the legislatures as one of the menu options when they're kind of looking at how to allocate funding and how to either come up with new water or reduce existing water. One of the tools that we're hoping to kind of learn from Santa Fe and extending is how to use those indoor conservation rebates to improve the resilience of your system.
Great, and that's a great segue for talking more about conservation. So the city was very successful, as Jesse pointed out, with indoor water conservation. And some of the work that the Water Conservation Committee is doing is now looking at what more can we do. And we have done a lot in the residential sector, but we are just beginning to tap the commercial sector. And so that's an area that still we can do more. Efficiency, I think, is going to be the big piece of any adaptation strategies that we need to be taking on as we address the challenges with climate change. And so certainly conservation, more conservation, not just, we've attacked the residential sector, that's only one sector, there's more that can be done there. And I don't know if you want to talk, we've got legislation being developed around multifamily homes and how the Green Building Code will apply to them. I don't know if either one of you want to just touch on that legislation. I know you're not that involved with it, but it is another area where we can see some savings, some efficiencies, we can do more to be more efficient. And I don't know if you want to touch on that at all, or.
So I guess all I would say is that it's an example, we I think harvested some of the low-hanging fruit, and the indoor rebate programs continue to create conservation for us, but I think I appreciate the creativity of the conservation program and the guidance under Councilor Romero-Worth of the Water Conservation Committee, which is a sort of a public body of volunteers to help look, okay, what's the next thing? And so as I sort of alluded to, I think moving towards figuring out how to have a green city with more water off of your roof than out of your tap is where we're going to sort of head as we start to be able to reuse water. But I think also the fact that they're looking at the commercial sector, you know, there's always some stone that remains to be, you know, turned over by the conservation program. So it's certainly a multifaceted program.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we often hear concern about the apartments that are being built in the city. Those apartments help us with affordability. They also help with water efficiency. And I think you touched on that briefly about how those big apartments are more water efficient than the single-family homes historically.
I think that's correct. Strictly from a water efficiency perspective, high density, water use indoors, less water use outdoors per person ends up being something that I think is very sustainable for us as a way to grow and have the green spaces that be more communal green spaces.
Right. So now I want to switch to planning because I think we can bring in the Congresswoman on that. So I think it's really important to know that planning is going on at all levels of government. Data is very important to all of that planning. And as you heard Jesse talk about the planning that's going on at the city, we're doing 40 and 80-year water plans. The state is doing a water plan, and the data that the Congresswoman championed legislation both at the state level when she was here in the state legislature, but then also as a Congresswoman is been taken that experience and elevated, and you touched briefly on that. And I don't know if you want to add more now that you've heard from our other panelists, Congresswoman, about how that data will inform this planning and ultimately how that planning helps us figure out the adaptation strategies that we're going to need for the future and how it's going to help us understand the efficiencies we're going to need to use the water we have very wisely.
Sure. Well, I'll start by saying that the description that you all just received from Dr. Roach about the long-term outlook for both supply and demand for the city of Santa Fe within the context of climate change, changing hydrology, understanding socioeconomic trends in the city, it all was presented in a neatly packaged description to you all. And that's the brilliance of folks who know what they're talking about, is that they can take a lot of complex information and distill it down into something that folks can understand. But I want to say that what you just heard is extremely unusual. And while I understand the modesty of Dr. Roach and not accepting the compliment, it is very unusual to have a PhD scientist and engineer who worked for a national lab doing complex modeling, serving as a municipal water manager, and somebody who understands global climate change models, is able to work with those models and hydrologic models, as well as socioeconomic data, to do the kind of sophisticated planning that the city of Santa Fe is doing. So the city is extremely fortunate to have such incredible water managers who really are using the best available science. Now, the vast majority of communities across the United States and the world do not have access to these kind of both intellectual resources as well as the ability to access data, manipulate it, and use it for water resources planning. And so part of why I introduced the New Mexico Water Data Act and the Federal Water Data Act is that, first of all, we don't have data on many of our water systems, and there are huge swaths of even New Mexico where we don't have real measured data. Something like 40% of the land area of New Mexico doesn't currently have stream gauges or water monitoring on it. And then for where we do have monitors, the data is modeled because we don't have really comprehensive monitoring. But a lot of data do exist, but it's not available to access, to manipulate, to turn into different kinds of tools. And when you think about the thing that has most transformed modern life, it's really the ability to access and use large quantities of data to help make decisions. You and I do it every single day when we use our handheld phone to figure out where we're going to get coffee in the morning, how we're going to drive to work, to buy things on Amazon. Those are information systems that are delivering large quantities of data to you to help you get through your day. But one of the challenges around water is that even though we have a lot of data out there, they've not been curated and made available in formats that we can easily use and access. And, you know, the ability to take data to make transformative management systems is growing exponentially right now. You know, many of you probably following the development of AI technology. That's the ability for computers and computer systems to learn as they go and to take in large quantities of data and actually analyze and manipulate it and tell you new things. But in order to do that, the data itself has to be available. So the purpose of why we passed a Water Data Act at the state level was to help New Mexico get its own house in order around data and to help bring more attention, resources, and coordination. And the Federal Water Data Act that we are trying to get through the Farm Bill right now does that at the national scale. And it's very similar to what began about 20 years ago to unlock the power of geospatial data. GPS, which most of us use almost every day in every single app, was originally a piece of satellite technology that came from the US military, and then it got turned into all these different ways of looking at geography and helping you tell yourself where you are in space. But it wasn't until there was a coordinated federal effort to make that data interoperable and usable in different formats that it really unleashed the power of that geospatial data to help inform almost everything we do. So that same transformation is needed in water data if we're going to be able to tackle these huge climatic changes that are happening in our hydrology, because we don't all have a Jesse Roach and you know, folks who can help manipulate data in very sophisticated ways and then translate that into information and policy. And so unlocking data will make it more available for folks all over the world to be able to use data in a more effective way.
Thank you. That's great to have that understanding of that important work that you've been championing for a long time. I think we do have a couple of audience questions. Do you want to ask those, Veronica?
The first one is, what initiatives or incentives are being used to reduce the consumption of water by agriculture?
I think that's a you question, Andrew.
Okay, thank you. So it depends on which part of the state you're in. One of the difficulties of talking about agricultural sector using 77.5% of water, and this is something we're tackling, is that the agricultural sector is vast. There's a big difference between being on an acequia in town or in Espanola or wherever you're on an acequia and being on a giant kind of center pivot system. And there's another whole thing that's being part of an irrigation district. There's a whole lot of different kinds of irrigation in the state. So there's different techniques that are tailored to those. Frankly, the acequias are, generally speaking, fairly limited to the amount of water on the snowpack because most of them are located on the side of a mountain and there's just not a reservoir above them. So there's some automatic scaling that happens with farming. Even folks who use groundwater, that's the case. We've heard of, there has been already a substantial reduction in how much water gets used for agriculture in the past 30 years or so. It's down 15% or so. In terms of specific incentives, there's projects underway in the Lower Rio Grande. There's some projects that are pilots in other parts of the state to look at that. It's really a pretty new thing for us to be looking at. The agency that I'm at really is about developing and permitting water rights. It's a real paradigm shift moment that we're at here. So we're really starting to test how some of those things could work and how effective they are. Because another thing I mentioned that of one of the many things mentioned tonight is that agricultural water kind of it comes back, right? A lot of it recharges groundwater. Pulling agriculture out of a piece of land has impacts, right? So trying to come up with some strategies that are tailored to different regions of the state to scale that back is something that's underway, but it depends where you're at.
Jesse, you had something to add to there?
And I thought, just quickly, I wanted to say, it was mentioned that our water use is tied to land use by developers needing to bring water rights. We didn't mention that those water rights are typically bought by buying a water right from a farm somewhere in the Middle Valley who no longer can use that water unless we lease it back. One of the, I think, exciting things that has happened in other states and that hopefully at some point we'll get to is when we go out and look for a water right, instead of looking for a water right, maybe there would be a list of projects that farmers have proposed to use water more efficiently, and we could pay for that. And then instead of taking their water right, we could take some portion of that salvaged water. And I think that's an idea that folks in the state have had, and we just haven't quite wrapped our arms around it, but it would be an exciting way to not dry up someone's farm, but instead allow them to use water more efficiently, and at the same time put some of that water into our savings account well field.
Many environmentalists are
Oh,
Go
Can
ahead.
I add one more thing? I think one of the things that often gets lost in the conversation about agricultural water use in New Mexico as well is that I really like the way the idea of balance was described. Water use is really about values. What do you value? And in New Mexico, we do value agriculture. It's part of our way of life. It's part of our hydrology. The acequias that the pueblos and the acequias have run for hundreds of years actually recharge our groundwater systems and play a significant hydrologic role in our bosque and other places. And so it's not necessarily desirable from a food security standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, from a landscape standpoint to dry out agriculture. In fact, we want to preserve those things. So where we are growing food, we want to grow high value crops that return good return to our farmers. Where there's traditional uses of agriculture, for example, in our pueblos, we want to make sure that those traditional senior rights are exercisable. And then, where we are trying to conserve water and it makes sense that we can do that. But sometimes I think agricultural water gets a bad name in these conversations. And actually, it is a value that we want to preserve in our state. The question is in what ways and where and how.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. And I think the key word in all of this is efficiency. We're going to have to be more efficient at every single level in every single sector. I think we're really close on time. Do you want
One last question.
One more,
One
okay.
last question. Many environmentalists are anti-growth and anti-density. How do you best explain managing growth with managing resources to someone who is skeptical?
You have events like this, and you try to give the big picture. Anybody want to try that?
I'm going to take a pass on anything related to growth policy. I guess really what I see as my job is to make sure that we provide a safe, reliable, and resilient water supply to meet the needs of the community. And if folks are pro-growth, they have good reasons for it. If folks are anti-growth, they have reasons for it. And those values I don't question. But I want to make sure that the conversation is not steered around the water resources. We have the water resources if we want to grow, and if we don't want to grow for some other reason, that's okay as well. But the water resources are not limiting to growth.
Andrew, do you want to try add anything? I don't want to put you on the spot. That's a
No.
big question. In 2 seconds or less.
Okay, in 2 seconds, let me first say I couldn't agree more that these water decisions are basically values decisions. I think that's absolutely the case, and I think one of the values that we have is trying to be an inclusive community, and I think that's something that we're up against as we look at some of these problems, and that's true across the state in the same way that we're trying to make sure to continue to be respectful of the traditions of farming. I think it's important that people can come to Santa Fe and be able to live in the town they grew up. So I don't know how we solve those problems exactly, but I suspect you do it through hard decision making. So that's what I got.
Congresswoman, did you have anything to add on that? Yeah, I'll just say it comes down to both values and math. I think, I can't see the charts, so I didn't see the charts that got presented. But what I can tell you is that in the 1980s, Albuquerque's per capita consumption of water was over 300 gallons a person. So if you think about the city of Santa Fe is under 90, that's crazy. Mathematically speaking, that's a third of what the average water consumer was consuming 3 decades ago in one of our largest municipalities. So, that's really a mathematical question, but I think that the last comment that was made about values is really important. And so in our communities, we need to have really robust conversations whereby the public and people are able to weigh in and say, what kind of communities do we want to live in? How do we want to allocate our water resources? How do we want our communities to look and feel? And do we want to prioritize water uses for those purposes?
Great, and I think on that, we will call this a wrap. Thank you all for being here, really appreciate it. Thank you to our panelists.